On a quiet southern night, inside a home meant to protect her, Miranda Whitford opened a door, and her entire world shattered in silence. In a single, breathless moment, the life she believed she had, the vows she thought were unbreakable, collapsed beneath the weight of a truth she was never meant to see. Now, as whispers of betrayal chase her into the darkness, Miranda must choose between the chains of the past and the terrifying possibility of a new beginning, a forbidden secret, a broken promise, and a woman standing at the edge of her own rebirth. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what do you love most about historical romances? Savannah, Georgia, 1877. The evening air lay heavy over Savannah, thick with the scent of magnolia and distant sea breeze, the kind of southern night that wrapped itself around the skin like velvet. Inside the Whitford residence, a quiet stillness lingered in the hallways, the polished floors reflecting the glow of gas lamps that flickered faintly along the carved mouldings. Miranda Whitford stepped through the front door, her gloved hand trembling just enough for her to feel it, though she prayed no one else would have noticed. She had returned earlier than planned from her visit to her parents, driven by an instinct she could not explain. A pull in her chest she had tried to ignore all afternoon. Her silk day dress, a delicate shade of pale blue, rustled softly with each step as she crossed the foyer. The house felt wrong, empty. Not the comfortable evening hush of a home at rest, but a silence that pressed against her ears as if the walls themselves hesitated to breathe. She paused at the foot of the staircase, staring upward, her heart already beginning to drum a warning she did not yet understand. "Samuel!" she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The clock in the parlour ticked steadily, unbothered. A faint draught slipped down the corridor, carrying with it the warm glow of a single lantern left burning near the far end of the upper hallway. It cast a narrow ribbon of amber light beneath one door, their door. Miranda hesitated, her fingers curling around the folds of her skirt. Her marriage had always felt like a porcelain figurine, beautiful from a distance, but easily shattered if held too closely. Samuel had never been cruel, never harsh, but he had remained distant, untouchable, like a gentleman carved from marble who believed affection was an indulgence he could not afford. She had spent years convincing herself that his emotional absence was normal, that her own longing was the indulgence. Tonight, that fragile illusion trembled without warning. She climbed the stairs in silence, feeling each step as if her feet carried the weight of another woman's fate. The closer she came to the lantern's glow, the faster her pulse grew, beating with a terrible rhythm she could not slow. Her hand reached for the doorknob. It was warm beneath her fingers. For a brief, fragile moment, she prayed he was simply reading by lamplight, perhaps having fallen asleep on top of the coverlet, the way he sometimes did when business consumed his mind. She prayed for something ordinary, something familiar, something that wouldn't crack the ground beneath her feet. She turned the knob and pushed the door open. The world, as Miranda had known it, died in that instant. Samuel was not alone. He was not asleep. He was not reading. Another man lay beside him, their bodies entangled, their intimacy undeniable, their breath rising and falling in a rhythm no married woman should ever witness. Miranda gasped, but no sound escaped her. Her throat constricted, as if her voice had been stolen before it could form. Her fingers slipped from the doorknob, and the door creaked faintly, betraying her presence. Samuel's head snapped toward her. His expression shifted from pleasure to horror in a heartbeat. The other man scrambled for the sheets, pulling them up as if silk could shield them from the truth now loose in the air. "Miranda," Samuel began, his voice breaking apart. But she stepped back before he could say more. She did not want excuses. She did not want explanations. She did not want to hear her own name spoken by a man who had never once spoken it with tenderness. Something cold and sharp pierced her chest, and for a moment she wondered if this was what it felt like to drown without water. Her vision blurred, her breath faltered, her heart constricted with a pain so deep it felt almost physical. She fled. Down the stairs, her hands gripping the banister, her dress whispering violently around her knees. She did not hear Samuel calling her name behind her, nor the hurried rustle of the man trying to disappear before he could be seen. All she heard was the fierce, merciless pounding of her own heart and the crushing echo of a truth she had never imagined. She reached her bedroom at the end of the hall, the room she used when Samuel worked late or traveled. Her hands shook so badly she could barely undo the buttons of her gloves. She pulled out a small valise from beneath the bed, the same one she used on short visits to her parents, and began to fill it with trembling precision. Her prayer book, a change of clothes, her mother's handkerchief embroidered with delicate violets. Her tears fell silently onto the fabric. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "what have I done wrong?" The question broke her, not because she believed it, but because she had been trained her entire life to look inward for fault whenever a man faltered. She had been taught that wives must be patient, silent, forgiving, pliant. Yet the wound she felt now was not one she could mend with silence. She clasped the prayer book to her chest, trying to steady her breath. The gas lamps dimmed as the hour grew late. Outside, a carriage passed, the wheels rattling on the cobblestones like distant thunder. The world continued its slow, indifferent turn, while Miranda's life hung in suspended ruin. She tied the ribbons of her bonnet beneath her chin, wiped her cheeks with a shaking hand, and slipped out of the room with her valise. She descended the stairs again, avoiding the shadowed hallway where Samuel still lingered. She did not look back. Once outside, the night air struck her with a humid embrace that smelled of river water and magnolia blossoms. She lifted her skirts and hurried down the street, the valise knocking lightly against her leg. Her steps echoed across the quiet pavement, carrying her away from the house that had never felt like a home. At the end of the avenue, she stopped beneath a gas lamp and allowed herself one final breath of the life she was abandoning. Then she walked toward the river, toward the unknown, toward a freedom she had not sought but now desperately needed. And as the moon cast its silver glow upon the dark waters, Miranda Whitford stepped into the beginning of a story she had never imagined for herself. The dawn broke with the gentlest shades of rose and gold as Miranda Whitford stepped off the modest riverboat that had carried her miles away from Savannah and the life she could no longer bear. The small dock beneath her feet groaned softly as though welcoming her with an old man's sigh. Before her stretched the quiet village of Willow Crossing, nestled between winding dirt roads and massive oaks draped with long veils of Spanish moss that swayed like silent witnesses to every secret ever whispered in the town's history. Miranda tightened her grip on the handle of her valise. The simple wooden platform was damp from the early morning mist, and the faint scent of wet earth and honeysuckle drifted through the cool air. There were no grand avenues here, no elegant facades or polished marble steps. Instead, small wooden shops stood like humble companions to the earth itself, painted in subdued shades worn by time and weather. The air felt gentle, untouched by the harshness of society's scrutiny. Yet for a woman fleeing the ashes of her past, even gentleness felt unfamiliar, almost fragile. She drew a steadying breath and began walking. Each step was careful, as though her feet were learning a new rhythm after years spent in restrictive propriety. The hem of her traveling dress gathered traces of dust, and her bonnet, tied firmly beneath her chin, shielded her face from the curious glances of the few townsfolk who were beginning their morning routines. A pair of elderly men stood outside a general store, sipping coffee from tin cups and discussing the day's weather. They paused long enough to watch her pass with faint curiosity, but not the invasive suspicion she feared. For the first time since leaving Savannah, she felt her chest ease, her breath no longer caught between fear and shame. Perhaps, she thought, this place might offer her the quiet she so desperately needed. The bakery appeared at the end of the road, its windows fogged by the warmth within and carrying the unmistakable scent of freshly baked bread that made her stomach tighten with a hunger she had ignored for too long. A wooden sign above the door bore the words, "Burroughs Bakery." Its lettering faded but sturdy. She hesitated outside, smoothing the front of her dress, wiping the faint traces of tears that she prayed were no longer visible. Gathering her courage, she pushed open the door. Warm air enveloped her instantly. Inside, shelves were lined with loaves of bread, rolls and pastries glazed with crystallized sugar. Behind the counter stood a woman with silver hair gathered neatly at the nape of her neck, her round face framed by wisps that had escaped her bun. She looked up, her brown eyes kind yet sharp, the sort that noticed everything without judgment. "Good morning, dear," the woman said, her voice carrying the softness of someone who had spent a lifetime comforting others. "You look like you've been traveling quite a long way." Miranda nodded, her throat tightening for a moment. "Yes, ma'am. I arrived only a little while ago." "Well then," the woman replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're just in time. The first batch is done and still warm." She reached for a loaf and sliced off a generous piece. "Here, eat. A journey is best faced on a full stomach." Miranda almost protested, but hunger won. She accepted the bread, its warmth seeping into her palms, as though offering comfort she had never known she needed. The crust was crisp, the inside soft and fragrant. As she swallowed, emotion rose unexpectedly in her chest, and she blinked rapidly to keep tears from falling. The woman observed her gently, then nodded with quiet understanding. "My name is Clara Burroughs. I run this bakery, and I rent the rooms above it. If you're looking for a place to stay, you're welcome to one of them." Miranda's breath caught, gratitude flooding her with a sudden and overwhelming force. "Yes," she whispered, "if the room is still available, I would be grateful." Clara's smile widened. "It's yours, dear. Follow me." Together, they climbed the narrow wooden staircase at the back of the shop. The steps creaked with each movement, echoing the age of the building, yet every sound felt warm rather than foreboding. Clara opened the door to a modest room with a small window that overlooked the quiet street. A simple bed stood in the corner, covered in a patchwork quilt of pinks, greens and blues. A wash basin rested atop a wooden dresser, and a vase filled with dried lavender lent the room a soft scent. "It's not much," Clara said, "but it's clean, and it's safe." Safe. The word washed over Miranda like a blessing. She set her valise down beside the bed and clasped her hands in front of her. "It's perfect," she murmured. Clara nodded once more. "I'll leave you to settle. Come downstairs whenever you're ready." When the door closed, Miranda allowed herself to exhale slowly. She removed her bonnet and placed it gently atop the dresser. Her hair, still pinned neatly in the style expected of respectable southern women, felt heavy. She loosened the pins, letting the chestnut waves fall around her shoulders. For a moment she stood silently, her hands gripping the edge of the dresser as she stared at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror. Her eyes looked tired, older, a woman who had known heartbreak before her heart had even learned to love fully. She cupped her hands over her face, drawing strength from the stillness. She whispered a quiet prayer, asking for guidance, for peace, for the chance to breathe without the sting of shame pressing against her ribs. Eventually, she washed her face, braided her hair with simple care, and made her way downstairs again. Clara was arranging pastries behind the counter, humming to herself with the contentment of someone who had long accepted her place in the world. "Feeling better?" Clara asked without turning. "Yes," Miranda replied. "Thank you." "If you're looking for work," Clara said casually. "Folks around here always need mending. We don't have many seamstresses, and the ones we do have are too busy to keep up with all the children in this town. I imagine you'd be quite popular." Miranda hesitated. For the first time in years, someone spoke to her as if she had something to offer rather than something to uphold. The thought filled her with a strange mixture of hope and fear. "I would be glad to help," she said. "I've done a great deal of sewing." Clara glanced at her briefly, her eyes assessing and approving all at once. "Good, then you'll do just fine here." Miranda helped in the bakery for the remainder of the morning, learning the small rhythms of town life. The bell over the door chimed softly with each customer. Some offered polite smiles, others examined her with mild curiosity. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, pointing at the pastries with eager eyes. Through the windows, she watched the dusty road, where horse-drawn wagons passed slowly, their wheels leaving faint trails behind them. The day unfolded with a gentleness she had not expected. It soothed her, though her heart still ached with every memory she tried not to recall. The betrayal she had witnessed the night before lay like a shadow at the back of her mind, waiting, watching. But here, surrounded by the warmth of bread and the quiet hum of small-town life, that shadow felt farther from reach. By late afternoon, Miranda stepped outside to breathe the fresh air. The sun hung low, casting long golden rays that filtered through the Spanish moss. A soft breeze swept through the street, stirring the hem of her dress and brushing her cheek with the delicacy of a whispered apology. As she stood there, a faint sense of belonging touched her heart. Not certainty, not yet, but something small and trembling, like a seed finding soil. She lifted her face toward the sky, closed her eyes, and allowed the warmth to settle into her bones. For the first time since her world had shattered, Miranda Whitford felt the quiet possibility of beginning anew. The sun rose higher over Willow Crossing, washing the village in a soft golden glow that made the Spanish moss shimmer as if touched by heaven's own hand. Morning brought gentle sounds, the distant lowing of cattle, the rhythmic hammer of a blacksmith shaping iron, the laughter of children rushing barefoot along the dusty road on their way to their lessons. Life here moved slowly, unhurried by the grand expectations and strict propriety that ruled Savannah's polished streets. It was in this peaceful rhythm that Miranda Whitford tried to let her restless heart find its place. She spent her early hours in the small room above the bakery, mending worn seams and sewing patches onto children's garments that had been dropped off by mothers who eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and gratefulness. The room smelled faintly of lavender and flower, the scent rising from the ovens below, where Mrs. Clara Burrows hummed hymns as she kneaded dough. Miranda welcomed the quiet work. Every careful stitch steadied her hands. Every neat fold calmed her spirit. By midday, Clara insisted Miranda take a short walk to stretch her legs. "A woman needs sunshine on her skin, dear, especially after a long journey," she said, as she handed Miranda a small cloth sack with a warm roll inside. "Go on now, take in the fresh air." Miranda thanked her and stepped outside, where warm rays touched her face like a tender greeting. She walked slowly along the main road, her gaze drifting over the modest storefronts, the wooden fences in need of paint, and the distant rolling fields that framed the town like a protective embrace. Children darted past her, their laughter ringing like bells. For a moment, she felt a pang of longing, of what she could not fully name. Her steps carried her toward the small village schoolhouse, a whitewashed building, surrounded by a patch of grass and a few scattered benches. Several children were lined up outside, waiting for the afternoon lesson to begin. Among them stood a boy who seemed apart from the rest, not by distance, but by stillness. While the others chatted and shoved one another playfully, he kept his gaze fixed on the ground. his hands clasped at his sides. Something about his posture tugged at Miranda's heart. Then, from behind her, she heard a male voice, deep, gentle, with an edge of weariness that carried more sorrow than age. "Thomas," the man said softly, "you'll be late for class if you stay out here." The boy did not lift his head, only shifted slightly, as if acknowledging the voice but refusing to move. Miranda turned and saw him. Robert Hale stood a few paces away, adjusting the collar of his simple work shirt as he approached the small group. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his skin sun-warmed from long days outdoors. His dark brown hair fell in soft waves that brushed the tops of his ears, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a mouth shaped by both strength and quiet heartbreak. His blue eyes, though steady, held a shadow that matched the boy's. Miranda felt her breath falter for an instant. It was not attraction. Not yet. It was something gentler, something that stirred like a breeze brushing across the surface of still water, a recognition of sorrow, meeting sorrow. The children greeted Robert with cheerful waves, but Thomas did not move. Robert rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Come now," he said gently. "Mrs. Fletcher won't wait forever." Even with the prompting, Thomas remained silent. Miranda could sense the tension in Robert's stance, not frustration, but helplessness. A father reaching toward a child whose grief had built walls too high for ordinary comforts to reach. She stepped closer, her voice soft. "Is he your son?" Robert turned toward her. Their eyes met for the first time. Her hazel eyes reflected the warm sunlight, yet carried an unmistakable depth of sadness. His blue eyes, steady and earnest, lingered on her face a moment longer than politeness required, as if he sensed something familiar in her expression too. "Yes," he replied quietly, "this is Thomas." Miranda offered a gentle smile, lowering herself slightly to be closer to the boy's height. "Hello, Thomas." He did not respond, did not even lift his gaze, as though the world beyond his shoes did not deserve his attention. "He's shy," Robert said, though there was something more behind the words, something heavy, unspoken. "Shy children often feel very deeply," she said, "sometimes more than we realize." Robert looked at her with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, as if her words had touched something he had long suspected, but seldom heard spoken aloud. But before either could say more, the school bell rang. The children hurried inside. Thomas hesitated, then walked slowly toward the door. Miranda and Robert watched him disappear into the building. "He has not spoken since." Robert paused, swallowing hard. "Since his mother died last winter." Miranda felt a sharp pull at her chest. The boy's silence now made sense. "I am very sorry," she said softly. "Thank you," he answered, his voice low, his eyes drifting back toward the schoolhouse window. He was very close to her. Losing her was more than a child should bear. She wanted to ask how he himself bore the loss, but she sensed the wound was still too fresh. Robert shifted his stance, suddenly aware of his own vulnerability. He cleared his throat, returning to formality. "Forgive me. I haven't asked your name." "Miranda Whitford," she replied. "I've just arrived in town. It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Whitford." His tone was respectful, but the softness in it struck her with unexpected warmth. "If you're staying a while, Willow Crossing is fortunate. We can always use kind neighbors." She lowered her gaze to the valise she still held, though lighter now that most of her belongings were in her room above the bakery. "I hope to be of use," she said honestly. "I'll be doing some sewing work." Robert nodded with approval. "There is no shortage of torn seams or growing children here. You'll have more work than you can manage." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Then it seems I arrived in the right place." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the warm breeze carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke between them. She felt something stir again, that same quiet breeze brushing across the water. Not desire, not longing, simply awareness. Before the silence grew heavy, Robert tipped his head politely. "I should return to the workshop. We're repairing a neighbour's roof today." Miranda stepped aside to let him pass. "Of course. It was a pleasure meeting you." He walked a few paces, then paused and looked back at her. Their eyes met once more. "I'm glad you're here, Miss Whitford," he said gently. The simple words, spoken with sincerity rather than charm, touched something deep inside her, something fragile, something she thought had been crushed beyond recognition. She watched him continue down the path until he disappeared behind the line of oaks. Feeling the faintest warmth lingering in her chest, she returned to the bakery, where Clara waited with another batch of bread cooling on the counter. "Well?" Clara asked, arching a knowing brow. "Well, what?" Miranda replied, setting her valise aside. "Did you meet Robert Hale?" Clara's smile widened, shrewd and warm. Half the women in town would faint dead away if he so much as looked in their direction. Miranda felt a sudden blush rise to her cheeks. "I met him briefly," she said. "He seems kind." "He is," Clara said with certainty, "and patient. A good man, that boy of his. He needs gentle hearts around him." She glanced at Miranda with meaning that made her breath a bit unsteady. "Perhaps you crossed paths for a reason." Miranda lowered her gaze, unsure of how to respond. Her heart was still tender, still trembling from the ruins she had left behind. She knew better than to believe in fate, yet the memory of Robert's voice lingered in her mind like a distant echo. The rest of the afternoon passed with a steady rhythm. Miranda sorted fabrics, organized sewing threads, and answered customers with quiet poise. Yet her thoughts drifted often to the schoolhouse, to the boy with downcast eyes, and to the widower whose sorrow seemed to mirror her own. Near sunset, as Miranda stood by the bakery window, she saw Thomas leaving the schoolyard. He walked slowly, his shoulders hunched, his shoes dragging through the dust. Robert approached from the opposite direction, wiping his hands on a work cloth. When Thomas saw him, he paused, his steps faltering for a brief moment before continuing. Robert knelt to greet him, his hand resting gently on the boy's back. Thomas leaned toward his father almost imperceptibly, like a fragile stem bending toward the sun. The sight stirred Miranda's heart with a tenderness she had not expected. It felt dangerous to feel anything at all, but also quietly healing. As father and son walked away, the fading sunlight glinting off their silhouettes, Miranda whispered to herself, "Perhaps some wounds can recognize one another." She pressed her palm softly against the window pane, feeling an ache in her chest, not of grief, but of longing for something she could not yet name. And as the evening shadows stretched across Willow Crossing, Miranda Whitford realized that this quiet town held more than safety and shelter. It held possibility, and possibility, after all she had endured, felt almost like hope. The following days in Willow Crossing unfolded with a deceptively peaceful rhythm, as if the town wished to cradle Miranda Whitford in its gentle hands and hide her from the storms she carried inside. Each morning began with the scent of fresh bread drifting upward from the bakery ovens, mingling with the soft sunlight that filtered through her window. She stitched clothing for local families, her fingers moving with calm precision, even when her mind wandered into shadows she tried not to revisit. The steady rhythm of needle and thread offered a fragile sense of stability, one she clung to more tightly with each passing hour. But small towns, even the kindest ones, carried whispers like seeds scattered by the wind, taking root where she least expected them. It began subtly, with certain looks lingering too long when she walked past the general store or greeted customers at Clara Burrows's counter. Some smiles remained warm, others grew polite, cool, curious in a way that pricked her skin like hidden thorns. After one brief morning stroll, Miranda realized the murmurs behind her had grown louder. She felt them like an invisible current, pulsing through the air. "Who is she?" she overheard a woman say near the milliner's shop. "Came without family, without a husband," another replied, lowering her voice. "You know what that means. Or perhaps she ran from something." Miranda quickened her steps, her face flushed with heat. She had always tried to remain invisible, to slip through the world without disturbing anyone. Yet here she was again, the center of quiet speculation she had not asked for. Clara noticed it too. That afternoon, as she kneaded dough with firm, practiced strokes, the older woman looked at Miranda with concern. "Don't mind the gossip," she said gently. "Some folks here cling to their habits like moss clings to bark. They see something they don't understand, and they make up the rest." Miranda folded a child's dress on the counter, smoothing the sleeves so she did not have to meet Clara's eyes. "I didn't want to cause any trouble," she murmured. "You haven't," Clara insisted. "But you arrived alone, well-dressed, with an accent that belongs more to Savannah parlours than to our fields. People notice. It's only natural." Miranda felt a wave of unease flood her chest. "And Robert Hale?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "What does he think?" Clara paused, raising an eyebrow as though Miranda had revealed more than she intended. "Robert is a decent man," Clara said carefully. "He sees people for who they are, not for the rumours that swirl around them. But don't confuse kindness with understanding. Even good men can misunderstand a woman's silence." Miranda nodded, though her heart fluttered with a mix of fear and warmth she had not invited. That evening, as the last traces of sunlight slipped below the horizon, Miranda carried a bundle of mended clothes across town to return them to a local family. The road was quiet, lined with towering oaks whose moss hung low enough to brush the tops of her shoulders as she passed. The evening breeze carried a hint of wood smoke, mingled with the scent of wildflowers growing along the fences. Her thoughts drifted toward Robert despite her efforts to remain composed. She pictured his deep blue eyes, the steady way he spoke, the warmth of his voice when he said her name. She remembered the sight of him kneeling beside Thomas, using tenderness where some fathers might have chosen impatience. Something about him unsettled her, not in a way that frightened her, but in a way that made her heart stir with unfamiliar emotion. As she approached the small cottage of the Jenkins family, she raised her hand to knock. Before she could, the door swung open, revealing Mrs. Jenkins with a grateful smile and a child tugging at her apron. "You're an angel, Miss Whitford," Mrs. Jenkins said. "I swear I don't know how these children manage to tear holes in their clothing as fast as I can buy them." Miranda returned the smile, though her thoughts remained a bit tangled. "They're just growing quickly. It's perfectly natural." Mrs. Jenkins leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "You'd best stay away from Mrs. Pierce and her friends. They've been talking about you all afternoon outside the general store. Ugly nonsense." Miranda's heart tightened. "What did they say?" "That you arrived with too little luggage for a woman of your refinement," Mrs. Jenkins replied. "That you might have left your husband, or worse." A cold knot formed in Miranda's stomach. Mrs. Jenkins sighed. "It'll pass. Folks in town talk because they're bored, not because they know anything." Miranda thanked her and walked back toward the bakery, the weight of the rumors pressing against her chest. She wanted to close her eyes and banish the echo of those whispers, but they followed her like shadows cast by lantern light. When she reached the bakery, twilight had settled over the town. Clara had gone upstairs to rest, leaving Miranda alone on the street. She climbed the wooden steps toward her room, the boards creaking beneath her feet. But when she reached her door, she stopped short. A single wildflower lay there, small, white, fragile, its petals soft and luminous beneath the glow of the lantern mounted on the wall. It rested against her doorframe as though placed with great care, not tossed or forgotten. Miranda bent down slowly, her fingers touching the stem with reverence. She lifted it gently, her breath catching in her throat. Robert. She didn't need to see his handwriting or hear his voice. Something in the simple gesture spoke more deeply than any letter or bouquet ever could. The wildflower was the kind that grew near the edges of the fields or along the riverbank, unpolished, untouched by cultivation. It represented sincerity, not show. A quiet offering from a man who understood the language of silence. For a moment, Miranda pressed the flower to her heart, closing her eyes to steady the unexpected tremble in her breath. A rustling sound behind her made her turn. Robert Hale stood at the far end of the landing, his hands in the pockets of his worn trousers, his shoulders rising and falling with a mixture of apprehension and hope. The lantern cast a warm glow on his face, illuminating the softness in his eyes. "Miss Whitford," he said quietly. Miranda's voice trembled as she replied, "You left this for me." Robert took a slow step closer, his gaze holding hers with disarming gentleness. "I thought it might brighten your evening," he said. "You seemed troubled earlier." Her breath caught. "You noticed?" He nodded with a tenderness that made her entire being tremble. "I notice a great many things," he said, "but only when they matter." Her heart fluttered dangerously, the kind of flutter that could lift a woman off her feet if she were not careful. She wanted to speak, to say something that might match the weight of his gaze, but her throat tightened with emotion she could not yet name. Robert looked down briefly, as if searching for the right words. When he lifted his face again, the lantern light caught the faint silver at his temples, a quiet sign of the burdens he carried. "People talk in this town," he said softly. "They don't always get the story right." Miranda swallowed. "And what do you believe?" A moment of profound silence passed between them, the world narrowing to the space of breath between their bodies. Then, in a voice that trembled with sincerity, Robert answered, "I believe you are a good woman who deserves kindness. Whatever brought you here, it is not something I need explain to know that." Her knees weakened, not from romance, not from longing, but from the unexpected mercy in his words. No one had spoken to her with such gentle conviction in a very long time. She stepped back slightly, afraid she might break if she stood any closer to him. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, as though sealing a promise he did not dare speak aloud. "Good night, Miss Whitford." "Good night, Mr. Hale." He turned and disappeared down the stairs, leaving Miranda alone beneath the lantern light, clutching the wildflower that had become a symbol of something her heart barely dared to understand. She entered her room and closed the door behind her, pressing her forehead to the wood for a long moment. Her pulse raced, her breath unsteady, her emotions rising like tidewater in the dark. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, she held a wildflower against her heart, and for the first time since her world had fallen apart, she felt something new stirring in her chest. Not fear, not sorrow, but hope. The morning after finding the wildflower at her door arrived wrapped in a golden hush, as if willow crossing itself wished to move softly around Miranda Whitford's fragile heart. Sunlight filtered through the small window of her room, scattering warmth across the modest quilt, the wooden floorboards, and the delicate petals of the flower she had placed carefully inside a glass jar. She dressed slowly, her thoughts drifting back to Robert Hale's gentle eyes, the sincerity that had trembled in his voice when he told her she deserved kindness. Those words had followed her into sleep, lingering like a whispered prayer long after her eyes closed. As she fastened the last button of her simple day dress, she realized her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the unsteady anticipation of seeing him again. She chided herself for it. She had no right to feel her heart stir, not when she still bore the weight of vows that had been shattered in the cruelest way, not when she still struggled to breathe without shame, and certainly not when her life remained so uncertain. Still, Her pulse quickened at the thought of crossing paths with him. Downstairs, the bakery bustled with early customers. Clara Burrows greeted her with a knowing look that made Miranda's cheeks warm. "There's a light in your eyes this morning, dear," she said, sliding a fresh roll onto a plate. "Someone must have slept well." Miranda lowered her gaze, trying to hide the blush rising to her cheeks. "I slept peacefully," she replied softly. "The town has been very kind." Clara's eyes sparkled with mischief, but she said nothing further. Instead, she handed Miranda a basket. "I need these goods delivered to the schoolhouse. Mrs. Fletcher ordered some sweet rolls for the children. Thought you might enjoy a walk." Miranda accepted the basket with gratitude, though she had the distinct impression that Clara was orchestrating something more than an errand. Nevertheless, she stepped outside, the warm sunlight brushing across her face as she made her way toward the schoolhouse. The path was quiet, edged by towering oaks, whose branches formed a soft canopy above her. Spanish moss swayed gently like silver curtains, whispering secrets she did not yet understand. As she walked, her thoughts kept circling back to Robert and the wildflower, white and fragile, a gesture without demand, an offering without expectation. She pressed her lips together, trying to steady the inexplicable flutter inside her. When the schoolhouse came into view, she saw Thomas sitting alone on the small bench beneath the window. His little shoulders hunched forward as if weighed down by memories. He could not speak. He held a small wooden toy in his lap, tracing its edges with slow, thoughtful motions. Miranda paused, watching him for a moment. Something fragile bloomed within her chest at the sight of him, an instinctive tenderness she had not expected. She approached quietly, careful not to startle him. "Good morning, Thomas," she said softly. The boy looked up, his blue-grey eyes wide and uncertain. He did not speak, but his gaze lingered on her with a trust so delicate it felt like a gift. Miranda offered him a gentle smile and held out one of the sweet rolls from the basket. "For you," she said, "if your teacher allows." Thomas reached for it hesitantly, his small fingers brushing lightly against her hand. The brief touch sent a soft ache through her heart. Not painful, but deeply human, the kind of ache that came from recognizing another soul's wound. As Thomas bit into the roll, Robert emerged from behind the schoolhouse, wiping sawdust from his hands. His gaze caught hers almost instantly, as though some invisible thread connected them. A slow smile crossed his face, one that deepened the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. Miranda felt her pulse stutter. "Miss Whitford," he said warmly, "this is a pleasant surprise." "Ah, Clara asked me to bring these to the school," she replied, holding up the basket. Robert glanced at the basket, then at the way Thomas sat near Miranda with an ease that was rarely seen. Something softened in his expression, a mixture of relief and gratitude. "He trusts you," Robert said quietly. "That isn't easy for him." Miranda's breath caught. "He's a gentle boy. He only needs time." Robert stepped closer, the sunlight catching the warm brown tones in his hair. "I've tried to give him time," he said, "but he barely looks at anyone. With you, it's different." The meaning behind his words settled between them like a carefully held secret. She felt warmth climb slowly up her neck, her heart tightening with a sweetness she dared not name. "Perhaps he feels safe with you," Robert continued, his voice low. "Sometimes children recognize kindness more quickly than adults do." Miranda looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond to such sincere praise. Her fingers tightened around the basket handle, grounding her before her emotions grew too wild. "I am grateful if I can be of help," she said softly. Robert hesitated, then asked, "Would you join us for a short walk this afternoon? The riverbank is peaceful, and Thomas enjoys being near the water. I think he would like to have you there." Miranda's breath trembled, though she tried to mask it. A walk, with Robert and Thomas. The idea felt dangerous in its simplicity, as if sharing such a moment might ignite something she could no longer deny. She forced her voice to remain steady. "I would enjoy that," she said. His smile deepened, warm enough to stir the air between them. Then we'll meet near the town well when the school day ends. As he turned to lead Thomas inside, Miranda stood motionless, her heart thrumming with emotion she had tried so hard to suppress. She clutched the empty basket to her chest, drawing a long breath before walking back toward the bakery. The rest of the day moved like a dream. She sewed garments with trembling hands, her thoughts drifting back to the schoolhouse again and again. She replayed the way Robert's eyes had softened when he looked at her, the quiet gratitude in his voice, the gentle brush of Thomas's small hand against hers. Each memory fluttered within her like fragile wings. When the afternoon sun dipped low, casting warm amber hues across Willow Crossing, Miranda changed into a clean day dress, a soft beige cotton that Clara insisted made her look like she belonged to the earth and sky all at once. She tied her hair in a low braided bun, leaving a few strands loose to soften her face. She looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror and felt a strange ache bloom in her chest. She touched her reflection with her fingertips. "Do not hope for too much," she whispered. "Do not forget who you are." Yet hope still stirred. She walked to the town well slowly, each step measured, her breath catching at the thought of seeing Robert again. The warm breeze carried the sound of distant cattle bells, and the earthy scent of pine drifted around her. When she reached the well, she found Robert already waiting with Thomas standing beside him. Robert's gaze lifted the moment he heard her approach. Something softened in his expression, something unspoken yet unmistakable. Miranda felt warmth spread through her limbs, grounding her to the earth and lifting her all at once. "Miss Whitford," he said, his voice low and warm, "thank you for coming." "It is my pleasure," she replied. The three of them walked together along the winding path that led to the river. The afternoon light painted the landscape in shades of gold and russet, the tall grass swaying in gentle waves. Thomas walked between them, occasionally glancing up at Miranda as if checking to ensure she remained close. When they reached the riverbank, sunlight sparkled across the surface of the water like scattered diamonds. The air smelled of wet earth and wild mint growing along the shore. They settled beneath a large oak tree whose branches stretched over the river like protective arms. Thomas knelt to play with smooth stones near the water, while Miranda and Robert stood nearby, watching him in thoughtful silence. "He seems calmer today," Miranda observed gently. Robert nodded, his eyes fixed on his son with quiet tenderness. He always liked being near the river. His mother used to bring him here. Miranda hesitated, sensing the weight of his memory. She must have been a loving woman. "She was," he said softly. "She had a way of seeing people, truly seeing them, but grief—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Grief took her slowly." Miranda lowered her gaze, understanding him more deeply than he realized. "I am sorry." Robert turned toward her then, fully, completely. His expression was both vulnerable and resolute, as if he had chosen this moment to let his walls fall. "You have a gentle soul, Miss Whitford," he said, "and I am grateful for every moment you've spent with Thomas." The words landed softly yet powerfully, like a hand placed carefully over her heart. She met his gaze, her breath trembling. "Your son is a blessing," she replied softly. "And you are a good father." Something flickered in his eyes, an emotion both tender and restrained, powerful yet held back with careful control. The tension between them deepened, woven from everything they didn't say. It hovered in the air like the pause between heartbeats. Finally, Robert stepped closer, his voice dropping to a quiet murmur that seemed to echo through her entire being. "If ever you feel uncertain here," he said, "if ever you feel alone, I hope you will remember that you are not." Her breath caught sharply, her entire body stilling. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to confess the warmth that had begun blooming inside her heart. But the words tangled against her throat, overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of the moment. Before she could respond, Thomas approached, holding a round stone in his small hands. He offered it to Miranda, his eyes silently pleading for her attention. She knelt to accept it, her heart swelling with tenderness. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered. "It's beautiful." The boy nodded, his face softening for the first time since she had met him. Robert watched the exchange with a reverence that made Miranda's breath catch again. She rose slowly, meeting his gaze. And in that soft, suspended moment beneath the golden light of the riverbank, Miranda felt something shift deep inside her, something tender, trembling, and far too precious to name. She walked back toward the town beside Robert and Thomas as the sun dipped low in the sky, her heart blooming with the fragile, dangerous hope of a woman who had never before been truly seen. The following morning dawned with a sky the color of faded pearl, soft and muted, as though the heavens themselves sensed the trembling undercurrent within Miranda Whitford's heart. Willow Crossing stirred slowly to life, the clatter of wagon wheels mingling with the distant chirping of birds hidden among the swaying moss. Yet despite the gentle hum of the town, Miranda felt an unusual heaviness settling across her shoulders, one she could neither name nor shake away. She sat at the small wooden table in her room above the bakery, a cup of warm tea between her hands. Her fingers curled around the porcelain, seeking comfort from the heat, while the fragile wildflower Robert had left her rested in its little jar nearby. She had moved it to the center of the table, unable to relegate it to a corner, unable to pretend it did not hold a dangerous place in her heart. Every time her gaze drifted toward it, her breath caught faintly. She touched the rim of the jar with gentle fingertips, as if the simple act could lend her courage. Clara Burrows knocked softly at her door. "Breakfast is ready, dear," she called. "Come down whenever you're ready." Miranda set her tea aside and took a moment to straighten her dress. As she stepped into the hallway, the warm scent of butter and cinnamon drifted upward from the bakery below. She followed it, grateful for a distraction from the inner unease she could not explain. Clara greeted her with a bright smile. "I baked your favorite today, the sweet rolls with lemon glaze." Miranda returned the smile, though hers trembled slightly. "Thank you. They smell delightful." Clara's eyes studied her with motherly concern. "Are you feeling all right?" Miranda hesitated. She did not want to burden Clara with worries she barely understood. "Just a bit tired," she said softly. "Yesterday was a long day." Clara nodded knowingly. A long day can weigh on the heart in ways one doesn't expect. The words struck deeper than she intended, and Miranda's fingers curled around her fork in response. Before Miranda could gather herself, the bakery door opened, and a young boy hurried inside, holding a sealed envelope. He looked around until his eyes landed on her. "Miss Whitford?" he asked shyly. Miranda stood, her pulse quickening. "Yes." "This is for you," he said, placing the envelope in her hands. The moment she felt its weight, her bloodstream turned cold. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. The envelope was crisp, the seal pressed with sharp, deliberate force. Her fingers tightened around it. "Samuel." Her breath faltered, and the room seemed to shrink around her. Clara noticed the color drain from her face and stepped closer. "Dear, is everything all right?" Miranda forced herself to nod. "Yes," she whispered, though her voice felt hollow. I need a moment." She excused herself and hurried upstairs, closing the door behind her. With trembling hands, she held the envelope against her lap. 1,000 emotions surged within her: fear, dread, sorrow, shame. It took her several minutes before she dared to break the seal. The paper inside crackled sharply as she unfolded it. Samuel's handwriting spread across the page in neat, rigid lines. "Miranda, your sudden departure has caused concern and confusion. Your absence has raised questions we cannot afford. I will not tolerate scandal. You will return to Savannah at once, so that appearances may be restored. Whatever you believe you saw was a misunderstanding. You misinterpreted what was never meant for you to witness. If you refuse, I will ensure that society sees your departure as abandonment. And you know very well what that will do to your parents' reputation. I advise you to stop this foolishness immediately. S. Whitford. Her eyes filled with tears before she reached the end of the letter. She pressed her palm to her mouth, suppressing a broken sound from escaping. The words hammered against the inside of her skull. Misunderstanding, appearances, abandonment, reputation. Not a single word of remorse, not a single acknowledgement of the pain he had inflicted upon her. Samuel sought not forgiveness, but control. Not reconciliation, but silence. He wanted her to disappear back into the prison she had escaped. Miranda folded the letter with trembling fingers and covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook with the silent weight of her grief. For several minutes she could not move, could not breathe, could not think beyond the crushing truth that Samuel still held power over her. A soft knock startled her. She quickly wiped her tears. Miss Whitford. The voice was gentle, male, familiar. Robert. She hesitated, unable to gather herself before he spoke again. I saw the boy deliver a letter, he said softly through the door. I just wanted to be sure you're all right. Miranda closed her eyes. She could not hide from him. She had no strength left for masks. Come in, she whispered. The door opened slowly. Robert stepped inside, his expression shadowed with concern. When he saw her tear-stained cheeks, his breath caught as if he felt her pain himself. Miranda, he said, his voice low, warm, trembling with emotion he did not dare express too fully. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. It was from Samuel. Robert's jaw tightened, but he moved closer with soft, careful steps. May I see? He asked gently. She handed him the letter with trembling hands. Robert read it, his brows drawing together in a slow, controlled fury. When he finished, he closed his eyes briefly, as though trying to steady the storm rising within him. This, he breathed sharply, this is cruelty. Miranda shook her head. It is the truth. He can destroy everything. My parents, their reputation. I cannot allow that. You owe him nothing, Robert said, his voice quiet but fierce. I owe my parents their peace, she whispered, her throat tightening. I cannot shame them. Robert stepped closer, so close that she could feel the warmth of his presence wrap around her like a fragile shelter. You did nothing wrong, he said softly. Nothing. You left a man who betrayed you. That is not shame. That is survival. Her eyes lifted to his, and for a moment the world fell away. His gaze held hers with a tenderness so profound it made her chest flutter. She felt the heat of him, the sincerity that radiated from his every word, and yet she felt the weight of an invisible wall between them. I do not know what to do, she confessed, her voice trembling. I do not know how to breathe under the weight of his threats. Robert reached out, stopping himself just shy of touching her hand, as if the air between them was charged with too much emotion. You are not alone, he murmured. Whatever happens, you will not face it alone. The tension between them tightened into something fragile and dangerous, something that fluttered in the space between their breaths. Miranda felt her heart reach toward him, felt the quiet yearning blooming like a forbidden flower, but fear coiled inside her, heavy and cold. I cannot let you carry my troubles, she whispered. You have Thomas, your work, your own grief. My burdens are not so heavy that I cannot share yours, Robert replied softly. His voice held such tenderness that her pulse quivered. She looked away, afraid that meeting his gaze again would unravel her completely. "You deserve gentleness," he said, "and freedom, and peace." The words enveloped her like a soft embrace, and for one suspended moment she allowed herself to feel their warmth, their promise, but she pulled back slightly, her voice breaking. "Samuel will never let me go." Robert's expression darkened with a quiet resolve she had not seen before. "Then we will find a way you can be free without needing his permission." Miranda inhaled sharply. "How?" "We will find the answer," he said, "and we will face whatever comes with the strength you do not yet realize you possess." He stepped back then, giving her space, though she could feel the echo of his presence linger in the air. "Take the day to rest," he murmured. "I will check on you later." As he reached the door, she whispered, "Thank you, Robert." He paused, turning his head just enough for her to see the trace of emotion in his eyes. "There is nothing in this world I would not do to see you safe." The door closed gently behind him. Miranda sat on the edge of her bed, Samuel's letter crumpled slightly in her trembling hands. Outside, the late morning sunlight drifted through the window, creating delicate patterns across the wooden floor. She stared at them, her breath unsteady, her thoughts tangled. Fear pressed against the edges of her heart, but beneath it, faint yet undeniable, bloomed the fragile warmth of the wildflower on her table, and the memory of Robert's voice, soft and unshakable. "You are not alone." The morning Miranda Whitford left Willow Crossing for Savannah arrived with a hush so dense it seemed to press gently against the world itself. Fog clung to the earth like a fragile veil, softening the edges of every tree, every fence, every memory she tried desperately to steady before it consumed her. The road leading out of the village shimmered with dew, reflecting the pale dawn light that struggled to break through. It felt like the breath before a confession, the trembling pause before a truth long hidden chose to surface. Robert Hale stood beside her at the edge of the road, Thomas by his side, both waiting as the small hired carriage approached with the slow rhythm of tired hooves. Miranda's valise sat near her feet, lighter than the one she had carried when she fled Savannah, yet heavier with the weight of what she now returned to face. She clasped her gloved hands together, feeling the faint tremor that betrayed her calm facade. "You do not have to go alone," Robert said softly, stepping closer. His voice carried the warmth of early spring sunlight, gentle yet unyielding. "I cannot ask this of you," she replied, though her heart had already surrendered to the comfort of his presence. "I cannot pull you into the shame of my past." He shook his head, a slow and resolute gesture. "You are not pulling me anywhere. I am choosing to stand beside you." Thomas tugged lightly at his father's sleeve, casting a shy upward glance at Miranda. His silent presence bolstered her in a way she could not fully explain. The boy's trust, tender, fragile, yet unmistakable, felt like a blessing she had never imagined she would receive. Miranda knelt to meet Thomas's gaze, smoothing a loose curl from his forehead. "Thank you for walking me this far," she whispered. "I will come back." He pressed a small polished stone into her palm. The same stone he had shown her days earlier by the riverbank. She felt her breath catch. "For you," he whispered, the second word barely audible, yet unmistakably real. It was the first time she had heard his voice. Emotion surged through her, and she closed her fingers gently around the stone, blinking back tears. "I will keep it safe," she whispered. Robert saw the exchange, his eyes softening with quiet pride and wonder. He placed a steady hand on Thomas's shoulder before turning fully to Miranda. "Whatever awaits you in Savannah," he said softly, "remember that your worth is not defined by that city or by that man. You walk toward your future, not your failure." The breath she drew in trembled faintly. She opened her mouth to speak, to thank him, to confess the unspoken gratitude pulsing within her chest, but the approaching carriage rattled the moment apart. Still, as she stepped into the carriage, Robert's hand brushed hers in the slightest, softest touch. A fleeting graze of warmth, a promise without words. The carriage began to move. Thomas waved once. Robert kept his eyes on her until the fog swallowed the road and the world shifted from the tranquil stillness of Willow Crossing to the weight of what she must confront. Hours later, the elegant streets of Savannah rose before her like a memory sharpened by pain. Magnolias bloomed in early-season splendor, their white petals glowing against the iron-wrought gates of grand townhouses. The air smelled of jasmine and river mist, yet beneath the sweetness lingered the ache of betrayal. Miranda stepped down onto familiar stones that had once felt like home. Now they felt cold, unforgiving. She walked with Robert a few paces behind her, offering silent support as she approached the townhouse she had fled. The shutters remained pristine, the brass knocker polished, the steps swept clean. Nothing had changed on the outside, but something inside had shifted irrevocably. Her breath quickened, shallow and uneven. Robert stepped beside her, not touching, not pushing, simply present, his quiet strength wrapped around her like an invisible cloak. "Whenever you are ready," he murmured. She nodded, lifting her gloved hand to the knocker. Before she could touch it, the door opened as though pulled by unseen hands. Samuel stood in the threshold. He looked much as he had the night she left, composed, immaculate, his blonde hair neatly combed, his blue eyes icy and calculating. Yet there was something new beneath his polished surface, a strain, a crack, a tension he could not fully hide. "Miranda," he said, his voice cool, "you finally returned." Her pulse hammered, but she lifted her chin. "I came to speak." Samuel's gaze flicked to Robert behind her, then returned to her with a cold glint. "You brought company." "Mr. Hale is a friend," she replied with quiet firmness. Samuel's jaw tightened. "We will discuss that later." He stepped aside, but did not greet Robert. Robert remained outside, leaning subtly against the wrought iron railing, silent yet immovable, a guardian she had not asked for, but deeply needed. Miranda stepped inside, the familiar scent of lemon polish and rosewater suffocating her with memories. The parlor glowed with afternoon sunlight, illuminating the meticulously arranged furniture she once tended with dutiful care. She stood still, steadying her breath. Samuel closed the door and crossed his arms. "Now that you have chosen to return, we can begin repairing the damage." She faced him fully. "I did not come to repair anything," she said. "I came to ask for what I deserve, for what any woman in my position deserves." His eyes narrowed. "And what is that?" "Freedom," she whispered. "I want you to release me." Silence descended like a thunderclap. Samuel's lips twitched in something between anger and disbelief. "Your delusion is becoming tiresome," he said. "You ran away without explanation. I have told everyone you were unwell, stricken with exhaustion. They believe me. Whatever lies you told them, I cannot live that life again. You can, and you will." His tone, sharp and commanding, echoed through the room like a blade slicing through silk. Miranda steadied herself, remembering Robert's words. "You are not alone." "I saw you," she said softly, her voice trembling but resolute. "I saw you with him. I saw what you tried to hide. You broke our vows long before I ever left." Samuel's face paled, then flushed with a cold, furious heat. "You misunderstand what you saw." "I misunderstood nothing," she replied. He stepped toward her, voice rising. "If you speak of this to anyone, if you tell anyone even a whisper, you will bring ruin upon your parents. They will be shunned, shamed. Their reputations will never recover." Miranda swallowed hard, but her gaze did not falter. "I will not be coerced into silence." "Then you leave me no choice," Samuel hissed. "I will ensure that society believes you lost your reason, a wife unfaithful, a woman who ran into the arms of another man. Miranda shook her head, trembling. Robert is not... Do you think anyone will believe your innocence? You left your marital home and returned with a man beside you. I do not need proof, only suggestion. Her vision blurred for an instant, fear piercing her like icy shards. Samuel's threat was not empty. He had power, influence, and a man in his position could twist any truth into a lie society would embrace wholeheartedly. Footsteps creaked from the hallway. Miranda stiffened. Samuel's longtime servant, Mr. Howard, stood there, older now, with thinning hair and weary eyes. He looked from Miranda to Samuel, the lines of his face tightening in silent disapproval. "Sir," Mr. Howard said quietly, "this conversation is not private." Samuel turned sharply. "You will say nothing." Mr. Howard stepped forward, his voice trembling with long-held truth. "I saw everything that night, sir. I saw the other man leave your chamber. I saw your wife walk out as if her heart had been torn from her chest." Miranda gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes, not out of sorrow, but from the sudden relief of being seen. Samuel's face twisted with fury. "You will keep your place, Howard." "I kept my place for years," the servant replied, "but Mrs. Whitford deserves justice, and I will speak if called upon, no matter the consequence." The walls seemed to tremble with the power of the moment. Miranda exhaled shakily, courage rising within her chest like the first breath after drowning. She stepped back toward the open door, her voice steady. "I am leaving this place, and I will not return." Samuel's voice cracked with fury. "Miranda, if you walk out that door—" But she did. She stepped into the sunlight, the air warm against her skin. Robert stood waiting. When he saw her, his expression shifted, concern, determination, and something soft buried beneath. She reached him, breath trembling. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, though tears clung to her lashes. "Mr. Howard, he spoke for me." Robert's gaze softened. "Then you are not as alone as you believed." Miranda looked back toward the townhouse, feeling the weight of years fall from her shoulders like crumbling stone. Her past no longer held her captive. Not truly, not anymore. Robert offered his arm, not in possession, not in expectation, but in support. She hesitated, her breath a fragile tremor. Then she placed her hand lightly upon his arm, and together they walked away from the house that once defined her life, into a world where secrets no longer held her voice prisoner, into a future where courage finally whispered her name. The days that followed their return from Savannah unfolded with a delicacy Miranda Whitford had never experienced before, as if each hour approached her with quiet steps, uncertain whether to offer comfort or confession. The journey back to Willow Crossing had been a blur of winding roads, rustling trees, and the soft clatter of the carriage wheels, a rhythm that echoed the turmoil of her heart. Robert had sat beside her in steady silence, allowing her thoughts to rise and fall like uneven tidewater. When she faltered, he spoke only enough to steady her. When she closed her eyes, he let the silence wrap around them both, like a shared cloak of understanding. But now, back in the small village that had given her refuge, Miranda found herself caught between two worlds, the life she had fled and the life trembling into existence before her. She stood at the window of her little room above the bakery, watching the morning sunlight spill across the dusty street below. Willow Crossing looked tender in the early glow, its humble homes framed by oaks draped in silver moss, the distant river shimmering like a promise. Townsfolk began their routines slowly, greeting one another with nods and soft chatter. She pressed her palm to the glass, trying to steady the ache inside her. "You are safe," she whispered to herself. "You are safe." And yet her heart trembled. A knock sounded at her door. "Miranda, dear." Clara Burrows called. Breakfast is ready. Come down when you feel able." Miranda exhaled, smoothing her dress before descending to the bakery. The warm scent of cinnamon filled the room, mingling with the buttery sweetness of pastries cooling on the counter. Clara stood behind the wooden table, rolling dough with strong, practiced hands. "You look pale," Clara murmured, wiping her flour-dusted fingers on her apron. "Did you rest?" "I tried," Miranda replied softly, taking a seat. "My thoughts were restless." Clara poured her tea and placed a warm roll before her. "That is to be expected, facing a past like yours. It does not simply vanish from the heart overnight." Miranda nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "I wish it could." Clara touched her hand, her voice gentle. "Wounds heal slowly, but you are not alone." The words, spoken with maternal warmth, settled deep into Miranda's chest. She took a sip of tea, letting its warmth spread through her. Just as she set her cup down, the bakery door opened with a soft chime. She looked up, and her breath caught. Robert Hale entered with Thomas beside him, the little boy holding his father's hand tightly. Robert removed his hat, his dark hair slightly tousled from the morning wind. He looked at Miranda with a tenderness she felt down to her bones. "Good morning, Miss Whitford," he said quietly. Thomas stepped forward, his small face brightening. "Good morning," he whispered, the effort clear but determined. The sound of his gentle voice filled Miranda with warmth so deep it nearly broke her. "Good morning, Thomas," she replied. "I am glad to see you both." Clara slipped away with a knowing smile, giving them privacy. Robert approached the table. "I hope we are not intruding," he murmured. "Not at all," Miranda said. "Please, sit." He settled across from her, Thomas climbing onto the bench beside him. The bakery glowed softly, the early light casting golden halos around them. Robert's gaze lingered on Miranda with a mix of concern and quiet admiration. "How are you feeling?" he asked. She hesitated. "Like I am walking with two hearts," she admitted softly. "One heavy, and one that fears anything too light." Robert's expression softened with understanding. "You faced a great cruelty, Miranda. No one walks away from that unscarred." She lowered her gaze. "I thought going back would bring closure. Instead, it awakened memories I hoped had died." "Memories do not die," Robert said gently, "but they lose power when faced with truth." "And what is the truth?" she asked, her voice tremulous. "That you are stronger than what tried to break you," he said simply. Her breath trembled, her pulse fluttering like wings against a cage. Before she could respond, Clara reappeared with a small basket. "Robert, Thomas, I have errands that need doing. If you're headed toward the fields, take these with you." Robert nodded gratefully. "Of course." Thomas slid off the bench. Holding the basket carefully, Robert rose, then paused, looking down at Miranda with a tenderness he barely masked. "May I walk you later today?" he asked softly. "Just a short walk. Nothing more." Miranda swallowed hard. "I would like that." A quiet smile touched his lips. "Then I will meet you by the riverbank before sunset." As he and Thomas left, Miranda watched them through the window. Her chest tightened with an emotion she could no longer deny, longing, tender, delicate, and terrifying. Later that afternoon, Miranda worked quietly in her room, sewing a hem with careful precision, but her thoughts drifted again and again to Robert, his voice, his steadiness, the way he looked at her as if she mattered, as if he saw not her shame, but her courage. By the time the sun began to lower, her heart fluttered anxiously. She dressed with care, choosing a soft blue cotton gown that Clara insisted brought warmth to her complexion. She braided her hair loosely, letting two strands frame her face. When she stepped outside, The air greeted her with the earthy scent of damp soil and river breeze. The riverbank shimmered beneath the descending sun, its golden hues reflecting across the slow-moving water. She walked toward the great oak where she and Robert had stood days before. Her breath hitched when she saw him there, tall, steady, his silhouette outlined by the dying light. He turned the moment he sensed her approach. "Miranda," he murmured. Her name in his voice felt like a caress. "I hope I did not keep you waiting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would wait as long as needed," Robert replied. He offered his arm, and though she hesitated briefly, she placed her hand upon it. Her fingers brushed the crook of his elbow, and a soft shiver ran through both of them. They walked slowly along the riverbank, the water whispering against the shore. Robert did not push her to speak. Instead, he allowed the silence to settle gently around them, warm and unhurried. After some time, Miranda stopped. She looked out at the river, her heart tightening. "Robert, I fear what is happening inside me." He turned fully toward her. "What do you fear?" "That I am allowing myself to hope for something I do not deserve," she whispered. "That I am reaching toward something forbidden." Robert stepped closer, his voice soft yet firm. "Nothing about you is forbidden." Her breath quivered. "But I am still another man's wife." "Not in truth," Robert said. "Not in the eyes that matter." "Society disagrees," she replied, her voice breaking. "And so does the law. I cannot allow myself to give my heart freely if I cannot marry freely. I will not live in sin, Robert. I cannot." Emotion flickered across his face, not disappointment but deep respect. "I would never ask that of you." "I know," she whispered. He reached out slowly, allowing her the chance to pull away. When she didn't, he took her hand carefully in his. His touch was warm, steady, reverent. "Miranda," he said, his voice trembling with sincerity, "I am not asking for your heart. I'm asking for the chance to earn it." Her tears fell silently. Robert brushed one from her cheek with the back of his finger, a touch so soft it felt like a vow. "Whatever stands in your way," he said, "we will face it with patience, with faith, with honor." A soft sob escaped her, gentle and full of gratitude. He cupped her hand in both of his. "You are not alone," he murmured. "Not now. Not ever." Miranda closed her eyes, letting the weight of his words settle deep within her. When she opened them, she looked up into his gaze, a gaze filled with tenderness, fire, and restraint. Her voice trembled. "Robert, I am afraid to love again." His voice answered with quiet conviction, "Then let us walk slowly until the fear becomes courage." Miranda felt something shift inside her, an uncoiling, a breath long held finally released. The sun sank below the horizon, leaving the river glowing with a faint silver sheen. But neither of them moved. They stood there, hand in hand, suspended in a moment that was not yet love but something just as sacred, the beginning of it. The morning after their walk by the river dawned with a brightness that felt almost unreal, as though the world wished to offer reassurance even before Miranda Whitford opened her eyes. Sunlight spilled across her room above the bakery, warming the wooden floorboards and catching the delicate edges of the wildflower Robert had once left at her door. It seemed to glow with the soft promise of hope, yet her heart trembled with a deeper uncertainty she could no longer ignore. She had slept little. Every time she managed to close her eyes, she saw Samuel's face twisted with threats, Robert's eyes filled with tender concern, and her own reflection. Caught somewhere between fear and awakening courage, her heart beat unevenly beneath her ribs, pulsing with questions she had avoided for far too long. How could she allow herself to feel such tenderness toward another man when the shadow of her first marriage still held her captive? How could she step into a new life if the law left her bound to a vow her husband had broken? How could her heart dare to bloom when she feared sin, judgment, and the possibility of scandal? By the time she dressed, smoothing the soft cotton of her blue day gown, she felt as though her thoughts had tangled into a knot she could no longer undo alone. Clara knocked gently. "Dear, Reverend Thompson came by early. He wishes to speak with you. He said it's important." Miranda froze. "Reverend Thompson?" she repeated, breath trembling. "Why would he wish to speak to me?" "I imagine he heard about your trip to Savannah," Clara said softly. "He cares for the people of this town. He likely wants to ensure you are not facing your burdens alone." Miranda nodded weakly and followed Clara downstairs. The bakery smelled of warm honey and fresh bread, comforting scents that wrapped around her like a gentle embrace. Yet her pulse raced as she approached the corner table where the Reverend sat, with a small, worn Bible resting beside his teacup. Reverend Thompson was a man in his mid-50s, with silver streaks in his dark hair, soft eyes, and a voice that always carried the weight of both truth and compassion. When he saw her, he rose promptly. "Mrs. Whitford," he said kindly, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Thank you for agreeing to sit with me." "Of course, Reverend," Miranda replied as she sat, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. "Clara said it was important." "It is," he said gently. "I have heard some of what you endured in Savannah, and though I will not pry, I know you carry a wound that deserves healing, a wound you have tried to conceal beneath silence." Miranda swallowed hard. "It is difficult to speak of such things." "I understand," he said quietly, "but silence often feeds fear, and fear can blind us to the truth God sets before us." Her breath trembled as she looked down. The Reverend continued, his voice steady. "Miranda, I know you came here to escape a life shattered by betrayal. You need not tell me the details. The pain in your eyes speaks clearly enough." Tears stung her lashes, but she blinked them back. He leaned forward, his tone deepening. "You believe yourself bound by vows you did not break. You believe your heart must remain locked away because the world or the law might condemn you. But tell me, child, do you truly believe God would ask you to remain shackled to sin, not of your making?" Miranda's breath caught. I do not know what to believe anymore." Reverend Thompson opened his Bible, turning it with slow reverence. His fingers stopped on a page worn from repeated reading. "The Scripture speaks plainly," he said softly, reading aloud. "If the unbelieving depart, let them depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases." Miranda's heart thudded painfully. He looked up, meeting her gaze with unwavering compassion. "Your husband broke your marriage, not you. You did not walk away from your vows. He cast them aside. It is not you who sinned, Miranda, but he who betrayed the sanctity of your home." Her breath hitched. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "You are not living in sin by seeking a new beginning," the Reverend continued, "nor are you condemned for desiring love that honors your heart. The law of men may try to bind you, but the law of God does not." Miranda pressed a trembling hand to her lips. "But, Reverend, even if that is true, I cannot remarry without an annulment, and Samuel would never grant it, not willingly." "There are paths," the Reverend said calmly, "ways sanctioned by both church and civil authority when a marriage is proven broken beyond repair. You are not without options, Miranda. You are not without hope." Hope. The word felt fragile in her chest, like a bird she had long believed too wounded to fly. He closed the Bible gently. "If you wish, I can guide you through the steps. I will stand as witness to your truth, and if needed, Mr. Howard can testify to what he saw. You are not as powerless as you believe." Miranda bowed her head, tears falling freely now. "Thank you," she whispered. "You do not know what these words mean to me." "I do," he said softly. because I see a woman who has suffered greatly, and yet she still stands. That tells me God has something far better written for your future." When the Reverend left, Miranda remained still for a long moment, pressing her hands over her trembling heart. The silence that followed felt lighter, warmer, like sunlight breaking through a storm. Later that afternoon, Miranda stepped outside to walk. The sun had begun its descent, casting the sky in hues of amber and lavender. Children played in the distance, their laughter carried by the breeze. Horses moved slowly along the dusty road, their hooves tapping a steady rhythm against the earth. She walked toward the fields, drawn by an inexplicable pull in her chest. And there, near the fence where wildflowers grew, she found Robert Hale tending to a broken section of rail. His sleeves were rolled up, exposing the strong, steady lines of his forearms. His hair was slightly disheveled, brushed back from his brow by a long day's labor. He looked up at the exact moment she whispered his name. "Robert." He straightened, removing his gloves, his gaze sharpening with immediate concern. "Miranda, what is it? Are you all right?" She nodded, though her voice trembled. "Reverend Thompson spoke with me today." Robert stepped closer, each movement slow, steady, full of a quiet power she had come to depend on. "What did he say?" "He said—" She swallowed. "He said that I am not bound to Samuel, not in the eyes of God, that I am not trapped." Emotion flickered across Robert's face. Relief, pride, tenderness, and something deeper she dared not name. "He is right," Robert said gently. "You deserve freedom and peace." Miranda's eyes filled again. "Robert, my heart is divided. I want to move forward, but I am afraid. Afraid of grieving again. Afraid of trusting again. Afraid of losing myself." He stepped close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence wrap around her like a breath of summer air. "You do not have to decide today," he said softly. "You do not have to decide tomorrow. Walk at your own pace, Miranda. I will not push you." His voice trembled with emotion as his hand hovered near hers, not touching, but so close that the air between them grew taut with longing. "But know one thing," he whispered, his words carried by the breeze. "Whether your journey leads you toward me or simply toward your own healing, I will walk beside you, without expectation, without demand, because your happiness matters more to me than anything else." Miranda exhaled shakily, overwhelmed. She placed her hand over her heart. "Robert, I do not know how to begin again." "Then let me begin with you," he murmured. Her eyes lifted to his, and the world seemed to slow, soften, breathe. Their hands moved at the same moment, his reaching, hers trembling. When their fingers finally touched, it was nothing more than a gentle brush, but the sensation ran through her like the first warm rain after a long winter. She closed her eyes, allowing the touch to linger, allowing herself for the first time to believe in the possibility of redemption. Standing there beneath the fading light of evening, Miranda felt something shift inside her heart. Not in fear, but in readiness. Not love, not yet, but the door opening to it. The morning of Miranda Whitford's hearing dawned with a soft, luminous clarity that felt like an omen, a gentle whisper from heaven that the long winter of her spirit was finally drawing to an end. Dew coated the grassy fields like a scattering of diamonds, and the sky stretched wide and serene above Willow Crossing, painted in hues of pale gold and tender pink. The village stirred slowly, lanterns extinguished one by one, as sunlight stretched across rooftops, but inside Miranda's small room above the bakery, dawn carried a different kind of weight. She stood before the cracked mirror, fingers trembling as she fastened the last button on her modest cream-colored gown. Her hair was braided in a simple knot, strands framing her face with a softness that betrayed the storm still churning inside her. On the dresser beside her, the wildflower Robert Hale had given her months earlier had long since dried, its petals fragile yet still intact, an emblem of hope that had survived despite everything. She touched it gently. Today, she would not face Samuel. Today, she would not confront threats disguised as civility. Today, she stood not as a woman escaping the ruins of her past, but as one seeking the right to live freely, to breathe without fear, to hold her head high again. Clara Burrows knocked softly. "Miranda, dear, the carriage is here." Miranda nodded, inhaling deeply before descending the narrow staircase. Clara waited with a warm, steady smile. "Whatever happens today," Clara murmured, taking Miranda's hands, "we are all behind you, and God is before you." The bakery door opened, letting in a gentle morning breeze. And Robert. He stood tall in the doorway, dressed in his best dark coat, the faintest silver glinting at his temples in the early light. His presence filled the room with something solid, grounding, powerful. Thomas stood beside him, small hand gripping his father's sleeve, his eyes bright with quiet encouragement. Robert removed his hat slowly, gaze fixed on Miranda with a tenderness that made her breath tremble. "Good morning," he said softly. Her voice wavered. "Good morning." "You look strong," he murmured, as though afraid to break the spell of the moment. She swallowed hard. "I am trying to be." "You are," he said simply, and though he did not reach for her, the warmth in his eyes held her more firmly than any embrace could. The carriage ride to the small courthouse in the neighboring town of Barrow Hill was silent for long stretches, broken only by the soft crunch of wheels on gravel and the occasional call of distant birds. Miranda sat between Clara and Robert, her hands resting nervously on her lap. Thomas sat across from them, swinging his legs gently, his presence calm and quiet. As the courthouse came into view, its simple brick structure modest compared to the grand buildings of Savannah, Miranda's throat tightened. Robert noticed and leaned slightly closer. "You do not have to speak unless you choose to," he said softly. "The Reverend and Mr. Howard will speak truth on your behalf." Miranda nodded faintly. Thank you." The courthouse interior smelled faintly of pine and ink, the wooden benches polished smooth by years of use. A few townsfolk sat quietly, among them Reverend Thompson, Mr. Howard, Clara, and even a handful of villagers from Willow Crossing, faces Miranda had only known in passing, yet who now watched her with quiet solidarity. The judge, a grey-haired man with a stern yet fair expression, entered and took his seat. He reviewed the documents before him, his gaze lingering on the statements provided by Mr. Howard and Reverend Thompson. "Mrs. Whitford," he said, addressing her with solemn respect, "you have petitioned this court for an annulment of your marriage to Mr. Samuel Whitford on grounds of abandonment of vows and moral breach. Do you wish to add anything to the statements presented?" Miranda stood slowly, her breath trembling. "No, Your Honor," she replied, her voice soft yet steady. "The statements speak the truth." The judge nodded. "Very well." Samuel was not present. He had refused to attend, sending only a formal letter filled with stiff denials and accusations of Miranda's fragile emotional state. The judge set that letter aside with visible distaste. Reverend Thompson approached the stand first. In calm, unwavering tones, he explained the religious significance of broken vows, the moral abandonment inflicted upon Miranda, and the path Scripture provided to those wronged within marriage. Then Mr. Howard spoke. His voice shook with age, but his honesty rang through the room like a clear, unbroken bell. He recounted the night Miranda had left Savannah, the betrayal she had witnessed, and the cruelty she had endured in silence. Each word felt like a stone placed gently yet firmly into the foundation of Miranda's truth. Miranda kept her gaze lowered, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. When Mr. Howard finished, the courtroom fell into reverent silence. The judge reviewed the testimonies carefully before looking up. "Mrs. Whitford," he said, "the law takes broken vows seriously, and in light of the testimonies and evidence presented here, the court finds your petition justified." Miranda held her breath. "It is the judgment of this court," he continued, "that your marriage to Mr. Samuel Whitford is annulled and that you are released from all marital obligations henceforth." Her knees nearly buckled. Clara caught her hand. Reverend Thompson bowed his head in quiet gratitude. Mr. Howard wiped his eyes discreetly. And Robert exhaled softly, as if he had held his breath for her all this time. His eyes glistened with pride, relief, and something deeper, something she dared not name yet. Miranda composed herself enough to thank the judge before stepping out into the sunlight. When the door closed behind her, the wind swept through the courtyard, lifting strands of her hair and brushing her cheeks like a whispered blessing. She looked up at the sky, blinking against the sudden brightness. "I am free," she whispered. The words trembled as they left her lips, fragile and wondrous. "I am free." A soft sound behind her made her turn. Robert stood there, his expression raw with emotion. He stepped closer with reverence, as if approaching something sacred. "Miranda," he said, voice thick with feeling, "you did it." "I did," she breathed, tears falling again. "I am no longer his wife." He took her hand gently. No rush, no claim, only tenderness. "You are your own." A single sob escaped her, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief. Robert lifted his free hand, brushing a tear from her cheek with the gentleness of a man who had learned how fragile hope could be. His eyes searched hers, full of unspoken emotion. "Miranda," he murmured, "may I ask you something?" She nodded, breath trembling. "I know your heart has been wounded. I know you fear moving too quickly, and I know you hold faith in the vows of marriage. But sis, when your heart is ready, not today, not tomorrow, but when you feel whole again, may I have the honor of courting you?" Miranda's breath caught in her throat. Robert wasn't asking for answers. He wasn't asking for promises. He was offering patience and love. Soft, restrained, profound love. She lifted her hand, placing her fingers gently over his. "Robert," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion, "I would like that very much." He smiled then, a smile that felt like sunlight spilling into her soul. Below them, Thomas approached with timid steps, tugging lightly at Miranda's skirts. She knelt, brushing a hand over his soft hair. He pressed something warm and smooth into her palm, another stone, small, polished, perfect. "For you," he whispered. Her tears fell freely, and she pulled the boy gently into her arms. When she looked up at Robert again, her smile trembled with unspeakable gratitude. They stood together beneath the wide Carolina sky, Miranda, Robert, and Thomas, like a small family formed not by chance, but by the broken pieces of life rearranged into something whole, hopeful and new. And in that moment, sunlight bathing them in quiet radiance, Miranda felt it at last. Not fear, but the first true breath of a future worth embracing. Epilogue, 10 years of light. 10 years had passed since the day Miranda Whitford stepped out of that modest courthouse with her freedom trembling in her hands. 10 years since she stood beneath the wide Carolina sky and allowed the quiet beginning of hope to take root in her heart. 10 years since Robert Hale, with tenderness and patience, asked for the honor of courting her, not as a man hungry for possession, but as one willing to walk slowly beside a woman learning to breathe again. And now, a full decade later, Willow Crossing had changed, and so had Miranda. The town had grown, though not so much that it lost its gentle soul. The dusty roads had been replaced with smoother paths, and new houses dotted the edges of the fields. A small church had been built near the river, its white steeple rising above the oaks like a quiet promise. The villagers moved with the ease of people who had worked, prayed, and loved side by side for years. Near the riverbank stood a sturdy two-story house surrounded by a wildflower garden that seemed always in bloom. This was the Hale home, warm, lively, and filled with the sound of children's laughter. Miranda stepped onto the porch, resting her hands on the polished railing as she watched her daughters chase each other across the yard. Grace, the eldest at 7, had her mother's thoughtful eyes and her father's stubborn courage. Little Charlotte, barely 4, had a laugh so bright it seemed to lift the very air. She smiled softly, the breeze lifting a strand of her hair. Every sound of their joy felt like a miracle, one she still thanked God for each night. Behind her, the front door creaked open. Robert stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, time having touched him with only the faintest silver at his temples. He wrapped an arm around her waist, drawing her gently against him. His embrace was familiar, steady, the same quiet strength she had leaned on all these years. "You're thinking too hard," he murmured against her temple. She smiled. "I'm remembering." He glanced at her, eyes warm. "Good memories, I hope." "All of them," she whispered. "Even the difficult ones. They brought me here." Robert pressed a tender kiss to her hair, the gesture full of a decade of devotion. "And I would walk every step again, if it meant standing here with you." She rested her head against his shoulder, letting the peace of the moment wash over her. Inside the house, Thomas, now a young man of 17, was teaching a group of younger boys how to carve wooden toys. He had grown tall and gentle, with his father's quiet steadiness and his own emerging confidence. The world had once stolen his voice, but time, love, and patience had coaxed it back, and now he spoke freely. He laughed. He belonged. He often said he could not remember life before Miranda's kindness found him, but Robert always shook his head with a smile and reminded him that it was Thomas who had offered the first stone. Miranda's gaze drifted toward the path leading into town. "I received a letter today," she said softly. Robert turned, brows lifting. "From whom?" "Mr. Howard," she replied. "He said Samuel passed away last winter." Robert was silent for a moment. A soft wind rustled the wildflowers below. She exhaled slowly. "I felt no anger, no triumph, only sadness. He lived his life trapped by shame he could never face. His choices cost him everything that could have saved him." Robert took her hand gently. "You gave him mercy long before you knew he would never seek it." Miranda nodded, a quiet ache blooming in her chest. "I did, and I hope he found peace at the end." Robert squeezed her hand, his voice steady. "And what of you? Have you found yours?" She looked out at the river, the place where her life had truly begun again, where she had first allowed herself to believe she could love without sin, without fear, without apology. "Yes," she whispered, "I have." Behind them, Charlotte squealed with laughter as Grace tried to catch her. Thomas's voice drifted out from the open window, patient and warm as he coaxed the younger boys to steady their carving knives. The scent of freshly baked bread rolled from the kitchen, where Clara Burrows, now affectionately called Aunt Clara by every child in Willow Crossing, was humming as she prepared supper. Miranda leaned into Robert's embrace. "The world has changed so much," she murmured. "Women now speak more freely. They question. They stand. Even in Savannah, laws are beginning to shift. Slowly, but shifting." "And you helped spark that change," Robert said, brushing her cheek lightly. "Your courage gave others courage." She shook her head gently. "I only walked where God allowed me to." He smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, "And I thank him every day that he guided your steps here." Miranda's eyes glistened as she lifted her face to his, awe still blooming fresh even after 10 years. "Robert." Before she could finish, he kissed her, slow, reverent, full of 10 years of tenderness and a lifetime still waiting to unfold. The same kind of kiss he gave her on their wedding day, the same kind that told her she was cherished, safe, and wholly loved. When they pulled apart, the late afternoon sun cast a golden halo around them. "At the river tonight?" Robert asked softly. "Just us." She nodded, her heart fluttering the same way it had the very first time he asked her to walk with him. "Yes," she whispered. "Always." As the sun dipped toward the horizon and laughter filled the air, Miranda Whitford Hale held her husband's hand, watching her children play, her son flourish, and the home she had built with courage and love. 10 years had passed, and the love that had once begun in quiet glances and trembling hope had endured not only time, but fear, grief, and the whispering shadows of the past. It had endured because it had been born not from passion alone, but from truth, patience, faith, and the steady choice to heal together. When twilight finally settled across Willow Crossing, Miranda lifted her face to the sky, her heart full. She was free, she was loved, she was home. Here's a heartfelt and powerful conclusion crafted exactly as you requested. Motivational, emotional, immersive, and perfect for encouraging engagement on YouTube. If this story touched your heart, then perhaps it is because Miranda's journey is, in many ways, the journey of all of us. A journey through heartbreak, fear, regret, and the silent battles no one else sees, toward healing, courage, and the rediscovery of our own worth. Her story reminds us that brokenness is not the end. That betrayal does not define the rest of our lives. That pain can be transformed into wisdom and sorrow into strength. And above all, that God does not abandon the wounded. He gently places people beside us who help us rise again. Miranda learned that love is not found in perfection, but in patience. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, consistent acts of kindness that rebuild a shattered soul. She learned that starting over is not a sign of weakness, it is the proof of a brave heart. And now, I want to invite you to reflect. What did this story awaken in you? What moment stayed with you the longest? What part of Miranda's journey felt closest to your own? Tell me everything in the comments. I am here, and I read each one with love. And if you reach the very end of this story, write the word redeemed in the comments. That way, I'll know you walked beside Miranda all the way to her final breath of freedom, and it will help this story reach even more people who need emotional refuge. If you feel moved to support the team that brings these long, detailed, emotional stories to life, you can send a super thanks with any amount you wish. It helps us continue creating more stories that comfort, inspire, and make your evenings richer. And if you cannot support in that way, sharing this video with someone who loves historical romances is another beautiful way to help. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here. Your presence makes every chapter worth writing. And before you go, don't forget to check the other stories I'm leaving on the cards above. Each one is waiting for you with open arms. Until our next tale.